So you know the phrase like hindsight is 2020? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay, I'm not the only person in this room who's heard that very ubiquitous phrase. I think what they really mean by this adage is that when we look back at events, I think particularly events leading up to a painful experience, we like to create stories about what happened. And creating stories helps us make sense of the world and what's happened to us. So I like on the weekends, when I'm not here with all of you, to sit on my comfy chair with my coffee and read The Atlantic. And The Atlantic recently suggested a actually like really old article, probably from about 10 years ago, about how people handle breakups, right? How people handle the dissolution of a relationship. And in particular, the authors of this article were really interested as to why some people really struggle with a breakup. And maybe you've experienced this, or you know somebody who's experienced this, where even months or years later, they're really trying to figure things out and are wrestling with the end of this relationship. And so the researchers, I guess, or the investigative journalists, compiled hundreds of stories that people had constructed, right, about their relationship post-breakup, and they found that they could actually divide folks into two categories. Right? There were those who had a hard time moving on. They felt that the breakup proved that there was some kind of fundamental flaw in them. Right? So looking back at all of the events leading up to the dissolution of the relationship, they saw that, oh, those are actually all signs that there was something inherently wrong with me, and that the end of the relationship proved that. And then those who were able to kind of pick up the pieces after the dissolution of the relationship, even if it was a really difficult and acrimonious process, they actually saw the events leading up to the breakup as external to their character, right? So they looked back and they said, I see the role that I played. Maybe actually I was the cause of the end of this relationship, but it's not a fundamental flaw in myself, right? It's actually something that I can learn and grow from, that I can change looking back at the past and thinking about how I want to move into the future. So it's really clear, the authors of this article were saying that really in any situation in our lives, the stories that we tell about how we got here fundamentally shape how we face the future. Right? So for the person who really looked back and saw an indictment of their character, who told this story that there's something about them that was inherently unlovable, they didn't have a lot of hope about what the future might hold. But for the person who's able to find purpose, right, in kind of the wins and failures of the past, that could see some kind of lesson to be learned, even if it was a hard lesson, and maybe it was a lesson that they didn't necessarily want to learn that way, but was a lesson nonetheless, they were able to see possibility in tomorrow and felt capable to meet whatever challenge was around the corner. So I mentioned earlier that the book of Deuteronomy is really Moses' swan song, but one other way of looking at it is a very long breakup letter to the Jewish people, right? Because Moses and the Israelites are going their separate ways, and like some breakups, it's just because like it's time to move on, right? Moses has to hand over leadership to a new generation, but he's going to take this opportunity in this breakup letter for imparting some wisdom, and part of that imparting of wisdom is actually looking back on all of the events that have led to this moment, and telling a story about how they got there. So I actually want us to read, if you still have your Chumashim on hand, yes? I want us to actually read part of this retelling. Like Moses actually retells the story a few different times in this breakup letter. We're gonna look at chapter 8, verses 1, etc. So I don't know what page that's on in the Chumash itself. Yeah.
You can find chapter 8, verse 1 in Deuteronomy first.
1039. Okay. I would love, just want to actually read, I guess I could read this live because I'm on the mic. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, yeah, so for those of us who are online. But the question I have for you is, in retelling this story, right, Moses is telling it in a particular way. Right? So what is the lesson, right, that Moses is trying to draw from the story, right? Like, how is Moses retelling the story? And how is that going to shape how we face, or how the Israelites in this case face the future, okay? Do you understand the question? Right? Moses is retelling the story, but he's retelling it in a particular way. I'll do my best Moses impression. You shall faithfully observe all the instruction that I enjoin upon you today, that you may thrive and increase and be able to possess or inherit the land that God promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember the long way that God has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, that God might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep God's commandments or not. And God subjected you to the hardship of hunger and then gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your ancestors had ever known, in order to teach you that a person does not live on bread alone, but a person may live on anything that God decrees. And guess what? The clothes upon you did not wear out, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Bear in mind that your God disciplines you just as, let's say, a parent disciplines their child. Therefore, keep the commandments of the Lord your God, walk in God's ways, and revere God. For God is bringing you into this good land, a land of streams and springs and fountains that issue from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, pomegranates, of olive trees, and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing, whose rocks are iron, and whose hills you can mine copper. And when you've eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land which God has given you. Take care, lest you forget God and fail to keep God's commandments, God's rules, and God's laws, which I enjoin upon you today, when you've eaten your fill and you've built your houses, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered. Beware, lest your heart grow haughty, and you forget your God who freed you from the land of Egypt, the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, with its seraph serpents, which sounds like a scary kind of serpent, and scorpions, a parched land with no water in it, who brought forth water for you from the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your ancestors had never known, in order to test you by hardships, only to benefit you in the end. And lest you say to yourselves, it was my own power and the might of my own hand that have won this wealth for me. Remember that it is actually God who gives you the power to get wealth in fulfillment of the covenant that God made on oath to your ancestors, and it's still the case. Okay, this is not exactly how I remember like the book of Exodus, right? This is an interesting retelling. So I'm curious from your perspective, right? What is the lesson that Moses is trying to impart here? Do what God says. Okay, sure, yeah, Catherine. Mm-hmm. Right.
So it could, like, he's like recapping his own lessons, but he's saying, like, take these with you so you don't end up like me.
Well, so it's so interesting, right? So what Catherine said is that, right, Moses mentions the rock, which is a triggering rock for Moses, because Moses didn't listen to God's instruction, right? Whacked the rock instead of spoke to it. Water still came out, but that was actually why Moses can't go into the land, right, with the Israelites. But what's really fascinating is that actually this retelling doesn't mention any of the mistakes that the Israelites did, right? Like, it doesn't mention any of the mistakes. It's actually quite, I guess, positive about them, right? The Israelites did a lot of, like, not great stuff. And complained a lot. Okay, implies. Uh-huh.
I think his main message is don't forget that God did this, because he did forget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think he's not gonna, he knows he's not going to be there to remind them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's implied there that he is actually like, I'm not going to like go into it, but you guys have to be better about this.
Okay. Yeah, you'll be better about it. But it's interesting that Moses fixates on the redemptive part of that, right, of the equation, right? The ability to actually move on from a mistake rather than, right, if we think kind of back to where I started this conversation, right? It wasn't like, you keep making mistakes. You are people who makes mistakes. You are bad people, right? Moses is kind of like, no, you're people who are able to remember, right? You're a people who can remember, which is like an inherently redemptive quality, because a person who remembers can learn and can grow.
Can I have prerogative of the microphone?
Yeah, of course.
So there's two things I notice in here. One is the theme of once you've eaten your fill and are satiated, don't forget to be grateful. Mm-hmm. Like, once you've built these houses and you're living in this land, do not forget that you didn't do this by yourself. You know, the implication being, not like you are bad and will forget, but the implication being like you are human. It is human that we all get comfortable and maybe too comfortable.
Yeah.
And God is like, do not get lulled into the illusion that this beautiful world will stay beautiful if you get lazy.
Yeah.
Like if you get spiritually lazy.
Yeah.
And I feel like that remains a timeless lesson. And then the other thing is, Moses does actually call them a stiff-necked people in other places.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting to see Moses as the parent who, or the friend who, or the person who kind of is maybe trying on different approaches to, coaching, you could say, or to therapy, and in this one, we like it better. We think this is more functional. This is the healthy version. Like in the other version, he's like, you are stiff-necked, you ungrateful people. But here, in this version, we're like, oh, here's Moses at his best. Like here's Moses helping them reframe so that they can learn the best that they might learn.
Or I might say, in each retelling of the story, right, Moses is teaching a different lesson, right? And so we see in this story that the lesson of a people who recognizes that it's outside of their power, right, is a people who then actually face the future with humility and gratitude. And we can have another conversation about the retelling of the story of you're a stiff-necked, difficult people, how that might, right, teach a different kind of lesson, right? But there's a very specific lesson here, right, which I think you hit the nail on the head there, which is like, right, a lesson of a people who are able to be responsive, listen, recognize that things are not in their control is hopefully a people who faces abundance and says, oh wait, I actually didn't earn this, and then we can have a conversation of, well, what does a posture of gratitude and humility towards abundance compel us to do ethically as we build this new society in the land? Right? I know, Aiden.
It jumps out at me in the text that it states the lesson that God wants us to learn, and it goes on to start into this great list of things he did. He brought us out of Egypt, he destroyed Egypt's army, but then it goes into this description of what he did to Dathan and Abiram, and how he opened up the earth's mouth and swallowed up not only them, but their tents, their people, their animals, their households, everything. And I get kind of lost as to what that lesson is. It was clear out.
Do you have any, I mean, you're feeling a little lost. Do you have any inklings or instincts?
I have to tell you, it doesn't make me feel grateful.
Exactly. Well, and that's maybe there's a sense of like there's different feelings to get from different stories, right? There's a gratitude story, and then maybe look, a good teacher, right, who has good pedagogy, teaches the same thing in different ways, right, for different students. And so there's probably the people who are sitting listening to the story be like, oh yes, gratitude, yes, I need that. You're totally right. And then maybe there's some people who are sitting there being like, whatever, I'm not. And then so then Moses is like, okay, you people are not paying attention. Remember that time the folks got swallowed by the land? And then maybe those people are like, oh shoot, like I should be paying attention now, lest I be swallowed by the land, right? That there's different kind of modes of engaging. Really, I think, I know I've repeated this in this space. Yeah, go ahead.
Just go more of the positive note. It's kind of like where am I bringing you to? If you're talking about just the negative that was done, then it becomes a negative connotation. But the key sentence to focus on is really like, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of watercourses, of fountains and depths that spring out, of valleys and hills, a land of wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and datum. That's the motivation. And you can't just have motivation isolated. There has to be something to connect to the motivation. But on a positive note, what you want to do is you want to put the emphasis of what God is doing, not the rebuking part of it, not where you were. That's there, and you should remember it, because that's necessary for the cocoon let's not do it again. But let's really put the emphasis on how wonderful the place is where you're going.
Oh, I think that there's a necessity there for all of these different pieces. What I was going to say is I feel like I often repeat the phrase of Reb Mimi Feigelson, who said that you should read the Torah as autobiography, right? That really, if we think about it, right, each of these lessons is necessary probably for different parts of ourselves and our hearts. That at different points in our lives, maybe the reminder of the goodness we have is actually what motivates us. And every now and then we probably need to be kicked in the butt, you know, like actually we all need, right, these different stories to speak different parts of ourselves at different moments in our lives. Okay, one more thing and then we'll.
I was really struck by how the mention of the manna, I think it was twice in the passage that you read, and you have what your ancestors didn't have. Like, you have something the generation before did not. And
Beautiful.
the implication is be grateful and aware that you have a resource they didn't.
To look back and to recognize the privilege of standing where we are because of the people also who walked that distance for us. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. So in a week, we're going to end the month of Av, which we're in now, and we begin the month of Elul. And as Rabbi Lizzie has reminded us, Elul really begins the countdown to the high holidays, and is seen as a time of taking stock of this past year, of doing cheshbon hanefesh, which literally means like accounting of our souls, and setting intention, personal intention for the year to come. Right? We tell a story about the past year to figure out how we're going to face the year to come, or maybe I say welcome and embrace the year to come. But we're not quite in that period yet of that personal accounting. The month of Av, which we're in now, also has us look into the past, but not our personal past, but our people's history. During this month, we observe two holidays, right? We have Tisha B'Av and we have Tu B'Av. And more people might be familiar with the former holiday, which is the day that we remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the accumulated tragedies that have befallen our people since then. We sit on the ground and we turn the lights down. We read the book of Echa, Lamentations. And as we read through this litany of terrible events, I think it would be very easy for us to tell a story of our victimhood as a people. And the fact of the matter is we have, as a people, been on the receiving end of undeserved and unprovoked violence throughout our history, but this is not the story that the rabbis actually have us tell on that day. So looking at the generation who lived during that time, and some of you might be familiar with this conversation in the Talmud, the rabbis ask, what happened? Right? What happened given that this generation was maintaining all of God's commandments? They studied Torah. They did all of the mitzvot. They literally did just as the story in Deuteronomy promises us, all the things that should guarantee a good future, yet they are the generation who lived through incredible destruction. And so the answer that the rabbis give is that they, although they maintained the mitzvot, that they gave into sinat chinam, of baseless hatred that tore apart their communities and pitted neighbor against neighbor. Might sound boringly close to home today. So terrible are the effects of hatred, the rabbis say, that they must be equivalent to our three worst transgressions, right? Idolatry and sexual violence and murder. By taking an active role, by telling a story where we are participants in the events leading up to the destruction of the temple, the rabbis teach that we're not merely victims of the past, but we have agency, right, to shape our future for the better or for the worse, but maybe I'll say for the worse or for the better. Which is why I think the next holiday of this month that we only observed maybe I think a week ago, this past Shabbat, is so important because Tu B'Av is a celebration of love, right? We move from hate to love. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel teaches that it is one of the most two joyous days in our calendar. So for next year, remember that. Lest you think Tu B'Av is not important, it is one of our two most joyous days. In the calendar, the story goes that people would wear white and go out into the fields to maybe meet their beloved, their beshert, the one they're meant to be with. And there's a tradition that people would actually borrow clothes from one another. right? Just in case you didn't have something white to wear, or maybe you didn't have the nicest white clothes, right? There'd be a communal pull of white clothing so that everybody could go out feeling beautiful and dignified. Nobody would be embarrassed by what they're wearing, right? We see how this is, in so many ways, an antidote to the kind of hatred that pulls apart communities, was a giving and a care and a compassion, right? Kind of a collective communal response of lifting everybody up. And so Tu B'Av, right, becomes the answer for Tisha B'Av. Hello, fly friend. I'd like you to go away. It loves me so much. So Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said that Tu B'Av is one of two most joyous days in the calendar. Does anybody know what the other one is that he said? Yom Kippur. Thank you. Who said that? Have you read this story before?
No, I've been in Mishnah for a while.
Don't call me out on repeating Torah. They do say, come back to it again and again and again. That is how we study Torah, because every time we encounter something new. So Yom Kippur, right? So Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, the two most joyous days of the calendar, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and also days on which we traditionally wear white. But it might seem like an odd choice, because after all, Yom Kippur is a very serious day. But I like to believe it's one of serious joy, because Yom Kippur teaches us through the process of teshuvah, right, of reflection, repair, and reorientation, that we are not trapped by our past. Rather, we can tell a story about our past that allows it to be something that we learn from, that we can change how we actually approach the future. So in this way, right, Tisha B'Av leads to Tu B'Av, leads to the high holiday season, right? Hate leads to love, leads to transformation. The lessons of Av, right, presage the work of Elul. The stories that we tell about our past, and therefore the stories that we tell about ourselves, really matter. So the question I want us to begin thinking about as we kind of come up on this month is, what is the story that you are going to tell about your past year? What's the story that you're going to tell about your past year? In your achievements, do you see happenstance, or do you recognize your hard work? In your heartbreak, do you only find despair? Or can you see the strength and resilience it took for you to go through it and reach this moment? In your mistakes, do you have a tendency to make excuses for why they happened, to point your finger elsewhere? Or will you take responsibility for the part you played in them? And in taking responsibility, understand that you also have the incredible power to repair what was broken. Are you going to listen to the voices from this past year that said you're not enough? Maybe one of those voices was your own. Or will you pay attention, right? Look for the helpers, as Mr. Rogers said. Will you pay attention to all the people who showed up in various ways to remind you that you are someone worthy of love and of care and of compassion, right? Including the voices of our tradition, which remind us every day, every Shabbat, that we are always beings of inherent worth and dignity, that we are inherently good. It's not that the facts of the story are going to change from this past year, especially those of us who moved through hardship. It doesn't abrogate the fact that we went through difficulty, but we can change how we tell the story, right? To remind ourselves that we are not victims of the past, we're not dictated by the past, but we have the capacity to grow and to change, to learn, to move through it, right? To recognize what it took within us to do that, and that actually is what enables us to face whatever is going to be around the corner in this new year. I think with anticipation, maybe a little bit of joy, but at least recognizing our strength, our resilience, our tenacity, our creativity. And so whatever lies ahead in 5786, I hope the story, I can't believe I'm saying that number, but I hope the story that you tell about this past year is going to enable you to have a truly sweet and joyous new one.